my own journey with the idea of autonomous teams and autonomy in general started sometime before I joined Zalando in 2014. But as Toby mentioned, that was where we really got to go deep on this topic and build up a little scar tissue, learned a few lessons the hard way. And then that's been part of my ongoing leadership journey. And it's actually quite a pleasure to share where I am now. Similar to the Spotify squad model, people very often have taken how we described radical agility at the time and moved forward on it without realizing that our thinking moved forward. So it's always a little perilous to take the ideas of others and just adopt them without contextualizing. But hopefully this will be a little bit of a tool set for how to contextualize that. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about the promise of autonomy and autonomous teams, and then the problems that we and actually many others I've spoken to with over the years have encountered. I'm going to introduce what I think is a better way to model the challenge of how to build successful autonomous teams and how to think about autonomy in a company. And then we'll have a brief Q&A, and I've got a handout to use in a breakout. We're going to break out into rooms of kind of roughly 5 for, let's say, 10 or 15 minutes. Let's see how time is going. And then I'd like you to apply the model, especially to maybe some of the problems that you are facing in your day-to-day life, and discuss with like-minded peers. And then we'll come back, have a group discussion and some Q&A. We have until 1:15 in case we need it. And yeah, let's get started. So, a lot of us read Dan Pink's book Drive, which was published, I don't know, around 2012, I think. And he had at the time, one of the most popular TED Talks about how to motivate, kind of, in my mind, I think of it, how to motivate smart people. And made a very compelling case for the importance of autonomy, and it was backed by a lot of research. And at the time, we spoke a lot of the difference between command and control and the kind of compliance of employees, and how by giving them autonomy and essentially cracking the code of how to make that work, this would lead to much higher engagement of especially knowledge workers. And so at the time, it felt very much like a key to unlock a secret. And it was time of low interest rates, and we were, growing companies pretty quickly. And so this was a huge deal that was embraced by a lot of different people in a lot of different ways all over the world. And certainly in Berlin at Zalando, we took this head on, incorporated it into part of a bigger transformation we called radical agility. And, off we went. I think it's not a big mystery why these things are important, but I thought it might be helpful to share some of what autonomy brings both to employees and to companies. One would think that autonomy for employees was not a difficult sell, but actually it can sometimes be harder than you might think based on the geography and kind of national origin of your team members. But ultimately, empowerment for employees and the sense of ownership is oftentimes appealing. The opportunity to innovate and be creative, as opposed to just like have someone else tell you what to do. If you've hired smart and creative people, they're going to be pretty excited about that. If we believe the evidence, there is increased engagement, and I think there is, more evidence over time that is true. The opportunity to choose your path a little bit more is also the opportunity to build more skills and develop those skills and the basic concept of mastery. And ultimately, being autonomous as a team requires that you collaborate and find synergy between people. And all these things combined for employees tend to make a pretty interesting place to work and really have impact. For companies, obviously selling them on the opportunity for innovation and having a competitive edge is pretty compelling. Being able to enhance productivity, especially through parallelism, and reducing decision bottlenecks, especially for startups that are starting to scale, is super compelling. It's very common, and many of you have probably seen, as startups start to scale, the founders become decision making bottlenecks. And as they hire and grow teams, things slow down. So finding a way to unlock what you're paying for is is a compelling proposition. Ultimately, being able to have different parts of an organization respond differently is going to lead to a more responsive organization in general, more agile in theory, and able to deal with competitive threats. Yeah, it's likely to lead to a more positive work culture if all the research is true. And ultimately, if it's in the zeitgeist and people are talking about it, certainly being able to deliver on that proposition is going to be important for attracting and retaining talent. So the positive view is very positive for everyone. It's kind of like, what could possibly go wrong? So in Drive, the picture or the model that Dan Pink presents is essentially that there are these three components that work together. Purpose, like really understanding the why of what we're doing, and a culture of mastery, so people are encouraged to become better at their craft. There's support for L&D and learning culture. And then combined with autonomy, the simple read of Dan Pink's work is that these three things, if you can get those in place, you're going to get a more high performant organization. So certainly at Zalando, and I've seen other companies, we essentially very much treated those as system inputs, essentially, to the organizational system that we were creating. We essentially anointed people in a way with this idea that, hey, we're going to give you the gift of autonomy. We recognize that it is a gift. We have, a very high view of the potential of humanity, and we want to create, enable a certain bottom-up organization. We want to be very purpose-driven, so everyone knows why they're doing it, and we want to encourage people who really want to be great at whatever craft they are doing, whether it's software engineering or data science or design, but that those, like believing very much, have the research, having drunk the Kool-Aid, if we give these things to people, good things will happen. That was very much the belief. And in fact, in some cases, that was true. However, there was unfortunately a couple years in, a bit of a sense of this doesn't really work. It sort of works sometimes, but it's not reliable. And not only that, it leads to a bit of chaos, I would say. What we found was where it worked well, it worked, I would say, almost perfectly. Smart people coming together, doing something great. Where it didn't work well, it was hard to get anything out of teams, and and in fact, the problems sort of compounded in certain ways. We heard things like, well, you've given me autonomy, and what I would like to do is stay on my team, but I'd like to be a fashion photographer. And isn't that what autonomy is all about? Which is all that's cool, but what we're actually paying you to do is write software, And so we unleashed something that was not quite under control, and that was, I think, the privilege of being like a hyperscale startup, but also became something of a problem. So in response to this, I and others started on a bit of a personal mission to figure out what do we, what do we know now, and what do we need to know so that the next time we do this, things work a bit better. And of course, all people all over the world have been working on different forms of this problem. One of them, quite famous and well known to many people, Henrik Nyberg, who is kind of the agile coach behind the Spotify model, spent some time kind of working on this problem and came up with I think, an interesting mental model for how this works, that alignment and autonomy are somehow orthogonal things. And when you have neither, you have essentially, total chaos. But with low autonomy, high alignment, is you have a very purpose-driven command and control which he represents as, hey, we need to cross a river, build a bridge, troops, go build that. So a more of a perhaps militaristic model. And the autonomy with high autonomy, low alignment was pretty familiar for some of our less well functioning teams, where somebody with relative seniority is thinking, hope someone is working on this problem, but what do? We can't command and control. So how do we get it? And of course, Nyberg's proposal is that by combining alignment and autonomy, things, crossing the river becomes the challenge for the team, and we can set them loose. And it's a pretty nice model, and it does work in lots of cases. And in fact, in the cases in Zalando in particular, I think where it was working well, that more or less was the model. Teams had a clear problem to solve on behalf of customers, and they could work away. But what this didn't do for us really was help us understand, okay, where it's not working. So it might explain why the success cases were working well, but it provided not much diagnostic help in understanding the failure modes, other than that, maybe the alignment isn't there. But okay, is that enough? For us, it was not. Digging a bit further, there's quite a famous book, Turn the Ship Around, some of you may have read, and there's a pretty good piece that's published on LinkedIn, The Art of Building Autonomous Teams, which draws from that and a bit from Spotify. And they present what I would simplify down to this model, which is that, if you have competence, like teams that actually know what they're doing, they're senior enough for the problems that you're solving, shared understanding, which is perhaps another way of talking about alignment, and people really trust each other, both directions, management to engineering teams and vice versa, those necessary conditions lead to autonomy, and that leads to the high performance that everyone is looking for. This is actually it's a richer model, I think, than the Nyberg approach. It gives you sort of different dimensions that you can focus on diagnostically. Are the people senior enough? Is there sufficiently shared understanding, not just of what's the problem to be solved, but also like, what is the business about? What is the company there for? What are the challenges that we face? And of course, trust is always a big thing. I'll put a pin on that for a second and share another simplified model, which came from Jim Freeman, who came into Zalando somewhat after this. Maybe some of you may even have worked for him. He used to say that autonomy has to be learned and it has to be earned, which sounds great. But again, it's not necessarily clear diagnostically. How do we apply that? What needs to be learned? What needs to be earned? It's sort of helpful in identifying that there is something that has to happen, but not necessarily what that something is. So working through these different approaches, I did hit upon what I think is a better way to think about autonomy. It does build on these ideas. But all those previous models sort of ignore something that was very much in the discussions with the senior leadership after radical agility, which was really around the word accountability. There was a lot of like, people got to be accountable for things. And I saw this tweet nearly in real time in 2017, when things, I would say, were not going as well as I was hoping. The good parts were going well, but the bad parts were pretty painful. And we didn't quite know how we were going to dig out of that. And I saw that tweet and it resonated with me, since I had heard people talk about, accountability. And I was a little bit on my back foot about what is accountability actually. It's a word people throw around, but it's not so easy to define what it is. And, for example, in German, my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's not a big distinction between accountability and responsibility. In English, and especially in US businesses, accountability is fairly crisply defined as unshareable. One person must be accountable. responsibility can be shared. That's useful for sure, but somehow ultimately there's a lot of nuance to something that's very, very important. So my observation was that people whip out the word accountability or the need to be accountable as a pretty negative thing. By the time people are saying somebody's got to be accountable, the shit has already hit the proverbial fan. And it's never really a positive thing, like ever. I can't really think of anyone who thinks about accountability as a positive. Like I really, maybe in small ways to advance your career, one might put a stake in the ground, but if one is ever being challenged to be more accountable, it's not a great feeling. So the first key insight really was that we can shift our mindset as leaders away from the lagging accountability to what do we look for in terms of accountable behavior? How can we describe how we need people, whether they're managers or senior or even more junior people? What does that actually look like? And there is, of course, a bit of a leap of faith that if we can describe in actionable terms what accountable behavior looks like, that will lead to situations where there is not the call for accountability when things go wrong. But I would argue that that simply must be true, or the whole system is broken. If we can't figure out how to get ahead of it, then, or I would say at best, it's not a useful concept. But I think most people think that the call for accountability after the fact is generally something real. It's not just wishful thinking. So what does that really look like? How do we need people to behave in order to say, hey, they're accountable? And for me, it breaks down to four basic things, or at least one word things. Actually, each one on its own is probably worthy of a separate discussion, and you can take it as deep as you want. But at a high level, we've got to have proactivity if people are going to be accountable. They can't be lagging around waiting for things to happen. They need to take initiative to actually improve the situation. One might think of that as a form of leadership. If you buy into the idea of adaptive leadership, for example, it defines leadership as essentially the activity of seeing a gap and taking the risk to close that gap, ideally through bringing others along. So that proactivity, that kind of like being a source of energy instead of a sink of energy, that's the first element of what accountable behavior, in my view, needs to look like. The second is around commitment. And this is more in the Amazon disagree and commit sense, or perhaps an idealized version of that. Commitment and authentic commitment, or even more positive, authentic commitment, happens as the output of a disagree and commit process typically. And not everybody is familiar with that. So let me give a quick overview. It isn't about disagree and commit does not mean like, even if you disagree, we need you to commit. It really is based on the idea that at the end of the day, as a group, we have to make decisions and we need everybody to support those decisions. We know that in a healthy discussion, people will have opposing points of view. And so in disagree and commit, and as a process, those opposing views are shared and discussed. And whoever the decider is, and it could be a more senior person, it could be a more junior person, it depends. They ultimately make a decision, but they make sure that everyone has had the chance to contribute, whether or not they agree with that. The commit part is then that once we have made that, we actually commit to it in a positive way. Even if we disagreed with it, even if deep inside of our hearts, we still believe it's probably the wrong thing to do, it's toxic to not support it and be part of an organization. And, it's, I have so many examples of my own misbehavior in the past. I was speaking to Nick Booth, who's in this call, not someone I know, but I knew someone with his name in a previous role. And I spent some years undermining someone who made a decision I disagreed with years before. This is like 25 years ago. And I still cringe when I think about that. This idea of commitment, like, okay, you didn't agree, but if you're going to stay in this company, you got to be behind it. You can't be like, well, it's a dumb idea, but I'm going to do it anyhow. You got to be like, yeah, we may not ever know if this was the right decision because these things are complicated and take time and it's a chaotic world with external forces. But committing to things visibly, positively, and authentically, key element of what it means to be accountable. The third piece of accountable behavior is around being transparent. Now, transparency is not a panacea. Too much transparency is problematic. Actually, there's a great piece in the HBR about 10 years ago called The Transparency Trap, which I did not include the references. Maybe I'll add that before I share the deck, about how transparency can be problematic. But the reality is that in order to create that alignment and in order to build trust, you have to be sufficiently transparent. And I would argue that there's really three dimensions where transparency is very important if you want to be showing accountable behavior. You got to be transparent about what is the problem that you're trying to solve or what is the goal. And I'm sure all of you have some experiences you can relate where people were less than completely transparent about what problem they're trying to solve. In fact, they had fallen in love with a solution and there was not general alignment around what's the problem we're trying to solve. And people went off and built things that were not actually that useful. Very, very common. So transparency, what's the problem we're trying to solve? What's the plan for how we're going to solve it, roughly? What's the progress that we're making, not against the plan necessarily, but toward actually solving that problem? The right level of transparency, and it's a judgment call, is, I would argue, essential to accountable behavior. You have to put a stake in the ground that this is what we're trying to do so that you can be held accountable for it. But by being proactive, it is like the day of reckoning form of accountability doesn't happen. Everybody knew what you were doing, how you were going to do it. It's through a commitment process, provided input. The final piece of accountable behavior, I would argue, is around the need to be curious. Now, there's so much here and there's so much to be curious about. But there's a few things that I think are more important than others. Although curiosity generally, to be accountable, I would argue, at least in any company I want to work for, and any company like a modern, innovative company, it starts with being curious about yourself and your performance. Like, how am I doing? How am I being perceived, both in a self-awareness perspective, but also like, what is the feedback that people would give me? That curiosity needs to extend to seeking evaluative feedback, but it also you have to be curious about what others' ideas are. You need to be curious about the other elements of accountable behavior. Curiosity is like is the thread that once you start pulling it, the whole sweater unravels. It can go everywhere. It's an unstoppable force. So again, it's a judgment call, but at the end of the day, we can generally see curiosity. We can identify curiosity when we see it, and we can encourage it in others. So, okay, part one of this model is around accountable behavior. Part two, then, is a synthesis of all the previous models into something that I think is ultimately a useful diagnostic tool to understand breakdowns where autonomy is failing, as well as a way to think about how to introduce more autonomy. So I'm going to share this, actually all of the previous diagrams we're going to share in a few minutes for the breakout session, so don't worry about that. So let me walk through this. So purpose and mastery, I think ultimately they'd remain inputs. Autonomy, hopefully is clear, is not an input. It's very much an output of some set of systems of how we manage and operate the company, how we manage our people, set expectations, incentivize performance. Learning and earning are also a key part of it. people do need to learn how to gain shared understanding in a company. They got to learn, how to be competent. And learning is something that obviously you can sort of do on your own, but at the end of the day, learning is about taking in. Earning is about giving out. So you both learn and earn competence. You got to do work, and you need to be part of the sort of like abstract guild of practitioners for what you do. You have to be accepted as good by the people around you. Trust is something that you have to work towards gaining. I used to believe that we could start from a position of trust and it could only be lost. I would argue that that is a very naive point of view. At best, we can start from a position of essentially zero neutrality. From there, we can go up, or there we can go down. But it's like attempting to short circuit and say, hey, let's just trust each other. The world is complex. People are complex. That's a very, very risky thing to do. And the thing is, it doesn't leave a lot of headway to build trust if you start from high trust. The safer is to think about trust as something that we're open to learning. Accountability and accountable behavior, we just spent a lot of time together. Those four things together are essentially, I would argue, the inputs that lead to a healthy form of autonomy. Teams know what they're doing and why. They're showing transparency. They are showing commitment. They are curious. They are competent. And they're actively working to build trust. If those are in place, autonomy has a high chance of working. If any of them are not in place, I would argue, it will be a problematic form of autonomy. My hope and my experience at this point is that by applying this model diagnostically, you can start to identify the kinds of actions as a leader that one might take to start to improve that situation. Okay, so we are now at the breakout point. I thought I would pause for a second and check the Q&A things. Looks like more of a okay. Thomas.
Maybe I can ask it out loud, and I'm
Sure, yeah.
okay with this being recorded. So I think when we're in a technology place, people tend to think about autonomy to select technology and architecture and all that. And we all know as a company grow, might be a problem if you have like 20 different languages and databases and architecture. So maybe you can talk about what you mean by autonomy, because personally, I think autonomy is more about, delivering an outcome, what business and customer value are we delivering instead of being to build that feature. So what is autonomy?
Well, I think it depends, right? So absolutely a common is like, should teams have the autonomy to choose whatever tools they want? And SoundCloud is an example that may have taken that to an extreme. Zalando, I think we started down an extreme path. I've worked for other companies where that autonomy was not something that was considered appropriate for teams. I don't think that there is a single answer, but I would say that this model still applies, but specifically around technology, it's about shared understanding that would lead a company one direction or the other. So, for example, if leaders of a company, say the founders, simply want to, bring a product to market as quickly as possible, and they believe, for example, that simple technology is good and there are benefits of being on one unified stack, and they can make the case, that becomes essentially, I would argue, part of the purpose, part of the shared understanding, and they're showing accountable behavior. Teams have to be working to build trust, and essentially, in that situation, they have to accept that that's just not a form of autonomy that's going to work here. Other companies have taken a very different view, that we're going to have, well-defined APIs, that we believe teams can make the right decision, implement those APIs with whatever technology they want. We might have standards around how we enforce the contracts and how those are tested, but we could essentially swap in different implementations and feel confident, within some reasonable confidence that nothing is going to break. Then that kind of autonomy would be okay. It's there's not a perfect answer for that. Over time, I've gone more from the second one to the first one, but that's only probably because the abstraction level that I have to look at a company's problems has gone up, and as long as everyone uses the technology I like, then everything's fine. I don't know. That's how I would look at it. Do you have you have a follow-up on that, or?
No, I think personally, I also think it's about the size. I've been working slightly smaller company than I believe you have, and if you're only like 40 engineers, it doesn't make sense that you have 10 different languages. And I know you have been running big organizations where maybe you did acquisitions, and I mean it's impossible to standardize on a stack. So
yeah, makes sense. Daniel, do you want to take the mic, or will I read aloud your question?
I can do that. So my question comes from the fact that here purpose is an input, and some of the most autonomous successful teams I've seen actually have purpose also as an output. So coming from the teams themselves, what's the direction? Because one danger is if we say our purpose is to build a bridge, then we are back at the point where we don't actually give teams the freedom. So what's your experience in balancing that and getting the purpose, the input big enough so that it works, but small enough so that the teams actually are autonomous?
Yeah, that's a great comment, because in an organization that's even a little hierarchical, you can think of it typically as something very close to resembling a tree, similar to a KPI tree, that cascades inputs into upper levels that essentially outputs of lower teams become inputs of higher level processes. And so whether something is an input or is an output, first of all, depends on what level of abstraction you're looking at. And so it is very reasonable, in my view, for a team to formulate a purpose and align that to make sure that it is kind of coherent with bigger company purpose. But I would also say that I think there's confusion about what people mean by purpose. And for me, it is helpful, for example, to have a company level purpose. I'm trying to remember, we did a very extensive exercise at Zalando. I was quite cynical about that. And ultimately, the company's purpose became to reimagine fashion for the good of all. And that was pretty lofty. Thank God you remember that, Toby. It did turn out to be a little bit useful. People started to talk about reimagining this and for the good of all that. But actually, much more practical, I would argue, is that what we mean by purpose is much more that we understand why we're doing things. And that gets into what is the problem that we're trying to solve. I agree it's a bit vague, and I haven't spent a lot of time talking about purpose in this one. Simon Sinek has sort of twisted the whole dialogue in a start with why sense. At the end of the day, people have a purpose if they know why they're doing something. And the question, what you're questioning self-selects what level in the hierarchy. Why are you writing this test? Why did you come to work today? Why do you work for this company? Why do you want to be a software engineer? Like, there's so many different levels of purpose that it's complicated. For the purpose of this model, though, I would argue that the virtue of thinking of purpose as an input is that an autonomous team needs to fit into a bigger structure. It has to be autonomous relative to something. And there, my intention in describing it as an input is that the surrounding structure, the management and operating model, need to provide that team with a reason for existing. that it can't be entirely determined by the team. That's my claim. Reasonable people could differ, but that's how I see it.
Thank you.
Okay. So, Chaya, I think you're going to administer now a breakout session. What I hope is that you can help me improve this model by trying to apply it to some real world problems. Let's go away, come back, and then let's plan to talk about what you experienced. You can apply it to one real life issue that one of you is having. Maybe there's time for several. But I think my hope is that this will be useful for you and you will have some insights. My hope is also that perhaps you will identify places where there's something missing or it doesn't quite work for you. That could be an opportunity to improve.
You're going to be split into groups of 4 or 5 and see you in 10 minutes. You have in Slack, you'll have the diagrams of the model, and I'll also put it in the chat so you can refer back to them during the session.
Well, how was that? Oh, yeah, Augustine.
Yeah, I thought to kick it off instead of waiting. But
Perfect.
We just had to finish our discussion. We had one point about the autonomy that feels a bit the way you presented it, and I think that's something that is important. Is that it's not that the idea that people go in completely different direction as they want, but that what we were missing a bit is the fact that we have a bit of an alignment coming back. Right, is that the autonomy doesn't imply that, okay, you'll do something and we won't talk again. And maybe that part is something that you need some structure to support the autonomy about how often do you realign, how do you often, to avoid the situation where a more senior person or from another group or from finance comes and say, well, it doesn't fit, so get back to the drawing board. Maybe that aspect was a bit missing.
Yes, that is. I mean, we could debate on whether this is the right level of abstraction for that, but that is, the mechanics of shared understanding, I think, is what I would look at there. What is the cadence that's required? What's the level of detail? I think it's pretty situational, depending on what's the state of the company, what's the seniority of the people that, But I do think that's an important element of the equation. And, it's like sometimes people go off for quite a long time. Other times it's like we got to have a regular cadence of alignment. And I don't think I wouldn't presume that there is a one size fits all solution there, but it is extremely important that everybody's clear on what is expected. I think arguably that can also be considered part of accountable behavior. Like, what is the right level of transparency here? Okay, so you have your hand raised.
Yes, I volunteer for our little group, and yeah, I hope that you didn't expect that we will improve the entire framework in 10 minutes. But what we talked with our group was about how do we measure the success. Of course, we want autonomy in order to reach high performance, and there are many metrics around that, but how can you tell if it's really due to autonomy? And I think this also sparked the discussion of have we, or at least speaking for myself, have we really seen high autonomous and successful teams? Because I'm not sure that everyone has such an example. And I can tell from my experience, I have more counter examples where I must have done something wrong along the line where this completely blew back on my face. And we also had a discussion about trust and yeah, how thought-provoking is what you said, because I also tend to say, yeah, trust by default in order to inspire people. And I've also seen that they're not working very well. So yeah, I think I need to rethink that trust by default and instead go back to the trust needs to be earned. And somebody in the group also said that it can be a bit of a micro promotion. It's something that if you present in the right way, people can be motivated, and as they get more and more trust, and with that, accountability and autonomy. So that was, I think, from our group.
Was there a kind of a consensus? I mean, you started out basically saying that you're not sure you've seen it really work. I'd love to hear more about that, because I think that's actually a pretty common sentiment, not something people may want to admit to sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot speak for everyone. That's why I speak for myself, because I know it's not a popular statement. But in my case, at least, working in a B2B where the roadmap is quite top down and very complex. Yeah, we do lack, like Marty Kagan would say, you're not a product team, you're a feature factory. And I would be like, yeah, okay, that's how we survive. So I think it starts from there, about how complicated the domain is and how often we need to react into things. And I've had my product team also feeling quite disempowered.
Yeah.
And this was the most I dealt with autonomy, by trying to make the people happy, but not necessarily believing, and maybe that was my fallacy, that there will be a better outcome. On the engineering side, I've seen way more success with autonomous teams, a bit more isolated from product though, like when it comes to handling technical debt and architectural topics and being proactive. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, actually, and that, I think that I'm glad you brought up Marty Kagan, because I had to make a choice here whether to get into the empowered product team concept that Marty Kagan describes quite well. I did include a reference, one of his works in the references. It is a funny thing, because if you were to read Marty Kagan with an uncritical eye, it's like, yeah, this is universally applicable. And it turns out the reality is definitely not. There are some situations where you actually need feature factories. There just it's a slow moving market, or like there was a period of invention and we removed the risk and now we just have a bunch of stuff to build. And they're having that kind of empowered product team mindset is not only not helpful, but sometimes harmful. But that is not easy to talk about. Matt, what you said about more autonomy on the engineering side resonates in that case. Anybody else from Costas' team want to chime in before we move on? All right, thank you. That was good insight. Alexi, how are you?
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Very good. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Eric. Yeah, so in our group, we discussed the borders of autonomy. Yeah, so because we went like, what does it mean autonomy? Yeah, for each CTO, and basically each of us has different kind of perspectives. And for me, it was quite interesting. Also, I got some quite interesting insights here from the last episode together with Tobias and senior staff engineer from Volvo, who was talking a lot about SLA and SLO. Yeah, so how they define this per each team. Yeah, because this is sounds like a contract between the business stakeholders and technical teams. Yeah, and if you define this contract, certain kind of KPIs, yeah, how fast API should respond, right? So what is the kind of agreement to have this kind of certain kind of metrics and numbers, and then the team has certain autonomy to achieve this SLA, yeah, and to achieve these KPIs, yeah. And basically, you as a also technical leader has more transparency, yeah. So what is your expectation from the business side, yeah? So and from the team, it will be more freedom to achieve these goals, right? But I have like a little bit different question, because maybe we can ask at the end, but it's what basically your experience if the architecture is not really mapped with the kind of team autonomous, yeah? So when you have like a lot of coupled systems with a lot of dependency, right? And you kind of as a CTO, VP engineer want to drive autonomous, yeah? You want to have this autonomous teams, but the architecture is not ready, yeah? So architecture is like some legacy system or something, dinosaurus monolithic system. And each time when the team wants to follow this kind of statement, right? You build it, you own it, you run it, but at the end of the day, it's really has a lot of dependency to the other team, right?
Yeah.
How you're solving this? So does it mean that our organization structure is not ready yet, or does it mean, or you're creating the organization structure for the future kind of architecture? How do you see it? Yeah. So what is your experience, Eric?
Yeah, I think, unless the team is prepared to pay itself, there's always bounds to what their autonomy has to be anyhow. And so it has to be very much appropriate to the business context that the team exists in. And what you described, I would say, there are significant constraints on anybody's autonomy in that situation, because the technology is essentially, it sounds like, a constraint if you want to organize in different ways. And you want to be able to have, groups of people that can work in a coherent way that's decoupled from what others are doing. It sounds like the situation is that decoupling it does not exist, and as a result, any kind of autonomy benefits are going to be essentially the downside of people behaving autonomously significantly would outweigh any potential upside. So, on the one hand, when there are significant constraints, that can actually trigger creativity. Nobody likes a completely blank canvas. But on the other hand, what you're describing sounds so constrained that based on what you said, it's kind of like there's two choices. One is like we're simply going to have to continue to operate in this space because of resource constraints, time constraints, money constraints, and it's worthwhile doing so, either to prevent insolvency or bankruptcy, or because it's actually still a pretty interesting opportunity, or there's a case to be made that we want to get to a better place that would enable scale and maybe at least have some kind of more modern product teams that could behave in an autonomous way with more ability to get into problem solving mode in a simpler form than having to align with every other single player in the system. And there, of course, that business case may or may not be makeable. But if it is makeable, then, probably through the strangulation pattern, you start to break apart that monolith so that you have some kind of like, domain-driven design bounded context where smaller groups of people can work interacting just with themselves and not everybody else. In general, like what you're describing, it sounds to me like, there's a complexity constraint, there's a time constraint, and there's a cooperation constraint. To make big changes requires aligning with a ton of people, and that alone becomes extremely expensive. But that would be my read on the situation. Good luck. All right. Well, the original plan was to shift into Q&A mode. I'd rather, if we continue going through breakout callbacks, if anybody else wants to go, but it's obviously a pretty open forum here. Yeah, go for it.
One point that also came up in our breakout, which for me was a bit of a horror when I very first ran into it a few years ago. Not everyone wants to be autonomous. So you can have teams where they say, hey, I became a developer so that in the morning I can open up Jira, see which tickets I need to do. In the evening, move the tickets I've done, close them, and then repeat without needing to talk to people or think about, is this the right ticket? Should I even be doing that?
Yeah.
And I know when I did the shift at my current company, we also had a shift in people working here, and it became harder to hire because of the high expectation on people to not only basically do as they're told, but take care of solving a problem. And I'm very interested also in how others see this. I'm very interested in how this will switch with the rise of AI, which might make the job to just solve a ticket less sellable than the job to really solve a problem. And also to understand how did you run into this? Did you also have trouble getting the right people when going for autonomy?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a great point. And, I mean, the reality is there's still plenty of software, right? And sometimes feature team is the right abstraction. Looking at those individuals, I wouldn't consider that to be a super job security situation, because if that's the way you work, that you're certainly opening yourself up to either being replaced by someone in a lower cost part of the world or by AI. But everybody makes their own choice there. And again, not every software development effort or product development effort is like, let's change the world, and those are just the ones I like working on. There's a lot of different points of view on this, so who can say. In terms of not everybody wants to, though, and can we hire? And I think there's a couple of sides to this. What we did find at Zalando, where we did a massive ramp up, that it went wrong in kind of two different ways, neither of them fatal, but I think both noteworthy. We did find that certain cultures were more open to being encouraged to be autonomous than others. And I don't want to go into specific details because it will probably reveal my own biases in an unpleasant way, but it was observed by many people that people from different cultures in Europe brought a different mindset to how entrepreneurial essentially they wanted to be versus how much they wanted to just be told what to do. We did find that was manageable, and that actually everybody made progress in terms of like, oh, actually problem solving is interesting. My take on it was really that the way the educational system works, like we go through school and we learn how to solve problems that are in fact solvable. And it's fun and it's satisfying and you get a dopamine hit. And different cultures, and I think the US perhaps is an extreme example where, for example, if you compare US and UK, they have a lot of similarity in terms of the educational system. Collectively, they contain most of the best universities in the world. But someone going through the American university system is 14 times more likely to want to start a new business than someone who goes through the UK educational system, which is pretty interesting. And it does, and you could even trace it back to, people who were brave enough to go to the new world compared to like, fuck that, I'm staying here. It could go all the way back to that. I don't know. But at the end of the day, it was about trying to help people, in my view, escape the idea that, okay, yeah, you can try to live in a domain where you're continuing to do homework problems that are solvable, or you can start to confront not all problems are solvable. And isn't it interesting to work on problems that may not be solvable? I don't know. I'm probably oversimplifying a little bit, but the problem is real. And also, it's not only about culture, it's about personality. And, it's hard to have any particularly generalized point of view other than I would say, watch out for it. The flip side of this is that we also, when I was at Zalando, through our kind of employer brand, attracted some people who were way too autonomous. They really had no interest in understanding what we're trying to do as a company, trying to like be part of something bigger than themselves. They heard the word autonomy in the employer branding, and they like were drawn to that like moths to flame. And that was an unexpected consequence of a swing too hard. So we really had the full spectrum, and ultimately, for the most part, we were able to pull people in the right direction. But again, it's ultimately whatever the context of the company you're in, and what kind of people you're attracting and have already, and what's possible has to be an important part of whatever decision that you make, to be more or less of anything, not just a kind of autonomous teams direction. Thomas.
So coming back to what I talked about before the breakout, and also triggered by what you said here, I feel one of the big challenges is, the scaling part, because when you're a startup and you're small, it's quite easy to get everyone aligned about, okay, this is the way we're going, and everyone is, talking to everyone, and it's also much easier to build trust and everything is good. the challenge I've been facing is when you grow the team beyond the place where everyone knows each other and might even not know each other by name. And you have made a lot of great book references, and I think there's one big one missing out here, which is the team topologies, which at least I have benefited so much from, because before the breakout, I talked about this, autonomy on technology versus others, and I revealed I've been working in smaller teams, but we introduced the platform teams quite early, and they were kind of like driving the technology part of our strategy, making sure that we were all using common technologies, the way we deployed and so on was the same. And we made sure when we did the hiring that no one was in doubt that if you go to our shop, we'll use these technologies, this cloud and so on. You can bring a lot of things, but please don't try to let us go to another cloud provider or whatever. So I think it's also, it's about expectation setting when you grow, because if you do what you said you did in the beginning, Eric, where you have a cowboy land when you're a startup, and then at a later point you have to align. I haven't been there, but I can imagine that it must be extremely hard to go for that one. I've been through a few acquisitions where I had to get different technologies into our stack, which was hard. Yeah. So I don't know if that was a question or more a comment.
Well, I mean, I'm a huge fan of Team Topologies and strongly recommend the book. And it didn't directly influence this talk, but I think it is it's an important design palette, or like design language for how to leverage Conway's law into a way that will definitely allow teams to be more autonomous. What you describe is definitely real, and maybe just a couple thoughts from my side. Things that I've seen, mistakes I've seen people make in what you describe, which is as you start to scale, what are some of the failure modes? Two that immediately come to mind. One is that this idea that collaboration is somehow a universal good, and it is not, and that comes through, I think, quite clearly, although they may not say it in exactly this way, but collaboration comes at a cost for people. It requires energy. And so you want to be deliberate about where and when collaboration is required. And it's an art form. There's no scientific process to figure that out. It's part of the art of management. But I've been in more than one company where it's like, we got to collaborate more, it's like, I don't know, why don't we consider collaboration to be a tool rather than a universal? And the other one is this idea that silos are bad, and it's related. And it's like, silos are really great for some things. They just have some issues that come up. If you can't silo well, then whatever worked as a small startup will quickly start to break down. And again, I think those silos contribute. The negative part of silos, obviously, that there's communication and alignment overhead. Positive part is people can focus and work together and be more autonomous as a silo. Yeah, I mean, I kind of am a little bit jealous that you have not had to make the leap in the larger scale thing.
Can I comment on the silo thing? Because I kind of agree silos can be bad, but again, I think there's different kind of silos. There's the silos where you have silos between teams. That's probably good because that's what gives you autonomy. But then there's silo across departments. If the salespeople are driving one agenda and customer success and tech, those kind of silos, I'm not so happy about.
Unaligned silos and
yes,
information
and that's coming back
silos.
to team topologies, where you say streamline teams. All the way from the customer problem down to ideally where you can measure revenue, which is hard in a B2B setup. But those kind of, they want to break down silos, but between teams you want to, build for autonomy.
All right, I think that's a good moment to pause here. What a delightful conversation. I'd love to keep going. I really appreciate Chai and Toby for asking me to do this, and for all of you for joining.
I hope we can repeat that, Eric, as autonomy, or at least your view on autonomy kind of changed and everything is evolving. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.